The idea we had was that we would organize a discussion around the key question, which is, do peace agreements necessarily mean the end of conflicts? The question might sound a bit strange for those of you that have not been following academic but also practitioners' discussions around the issue of peace agreements. But I think in reality, there is quite a lot to discuss in terms of what kind of agreements are we talking about when we talk about a peace agreement, and what is the actual impact of these agreements on the ground at various levels, not only at the elite level, but also more grassroots level, and what is the impact of such agreements or the different kind of agreements on sustainable peace. The topic is obviously very important for us at the MEDirections program, since our research work, but also the dialogue support that we've been conducting over the past years, have very much focused on dynamics of conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa region, also to a lesser extent focused on mediation processes and, broadly speaking, peace building. The topic is even more important for us, and I mean important and timely for us at the Libya initiative of the MEDirections program, especially as this roundtable coincides with the launching of the new phase of the new Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which has been initiated a few days ago under the UN leadership. So because of this, the kind of work that we've been conducting with the program, we thought that it was very important to try and bring together different speakers that could bring different complementary approaches to these very complex practical and theoretical issues, so that we could look and discuss these questions through different angles. For this reason, we invited today three very distinguished speakers coming from different backgrounds. First of all, I mean, I'm mentioning them in the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Mac Ginty, who is currently Professor of Defense, Development and Diplomacy at Durham University, is also the director of the Durham Global Security Institute. He also edits the journal Peace Building and direct a project called Everyday Peace Indicators. Our second speaker will be Mr. Mariano Aguirre, who is currently an associate fellow at Chatham House in London. But prior to that, he was also a senior advisor to the UN in Colombia, and also the director for many years of the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution, NOREF. Last but not least, to also make sure that we really dig deep into the practice of peace agreements, we'll have with us Ambassador Roland Kobia, who is currently the EU Special Envoy for Afghanistan. But Ambassador Kobia also has more than 30 years experience in the field of foreign policy, conflict resolution, formal and informal negotiations. And among his posting, he's been the EU ambassador to Myanmar between 2013 and 2017. Just to say that I think with this quite wonderful lineup, we're going to be able to address the issue through very different angles. And I'm sure that the discussion can be really bring into the light some very relevant conclusions also for the work of those of us focusing on peace building, mediation, and conflict resolution, both through the research and the practice angles. A few instructions just before I give the floor to the speakers. I've been asked to also give a few indications for housekeeping, as is being called. So the Q&A session, in which all of the attendees will be allowed to intervene, will take place after the three presentations. So we just have the three presentations without interruption, and then we can have the Q&A. Please refrain from typing any questions or comments during the presentations. We'll open the chat just at the end of the presentations. The second point is that when you ask a question during the Q&A, please write down your name in the public chat, wait for the acknowledgement by the chair, and then unmute your microphone and speak up. And finally, note for everybody, the first part of the event, which means the presentations, will be video recorded. We might disseminate it later, but the second part, the Q&A, will not be recorded, and we will be applying Chatham House rules. So the Q&A sessions, either from the speaker's side, but also the attendees, please feel free to just express yourself as freely as you want, and this can be a very much open discussion. So thank you very much for being here again. I will immediately give the floor to Professor Mac Ginty, whom I think has some presentation to share with us on the screen. And you have the floor, Professor Mac Ginty, for around 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's humbling to be on a panel with such expertise. What I'm going to say is quite conceptual, but it's drawn from on-the-ground research, and hopefully it will complement what we're going to hear later, which probably will take a more concentrated look at peace agreements and the capacity of agreements to affect peace. I want to make 2 points. And it's worth bearing in mind that I hold no particular expertise on a particular conflict. I am very much a comparativist, and that means looking well beyond the Middle East and North Africa. And the 2 points that I want to make are, first of all, I think it's worth seeing peace as a verb as well as a noun. In other words, peace is enacted and embodied. It is made and remade. So peace agreements are very much about declaring peace. A peace agreement is a noun. It is an actual thing. It is a piece of paper. I'm interested in the next step. What turns the noun into the verb? The second point that I would like to make in this short presentation is that peace is local. And I really want to unpack what we mean by local, because it's been one of those words that is thrown around over the past decade in relation to peace, like resilience or sustainability or participation. But what do we really mean by local? And I want to make the point that peace is hyper-local, that it really comes into effect at the level of the household, the home, the neighborhood, the route that you take to school, the route that you take when you commute to work, in your favorite coffee shop or bakery, so that it is hyper-local rather than just local. So those are the 2 points I want to make. Let me frame them by stepping back a little and saying something about the importance of peace accords. Very often these are national agreements. They provide the framework in which this local peace, or this peace as a verb, can take life. So peace accords are usually written. Very often they are ratified through processes, perhaps international legal processes or a referendum. Often they are internationally supported and endorsed. They provide a framework for peace. But if you think about that word framework, think about it in a horticultural sense of growing something. The framework is just the frame. The real actor, the real deal, is the plant that you're growing. So this framework for peace might give a language that others can use. It might give a symbolic moment. It might empower conflict disruption, the ability of actors to disrupt the logic of conflict with a new logic of less than conflict. It might give permission for actors at all levels to act differently. So I'm just going to very briefly share my screen. I think I need permission to do so from the the hosts. I'll move on. If we can share the screen later, then that would be an advantage, but you'll see that the PowerPoint I prepared is minimalist.
I'm just checking, yeah.
To say the least. So the first point that I said I would make was that peace is a verb. Yes, of course it's a noun as well. It is declared, it is a document, but it's also a verb because it's embodied, it is enacted, it is activated, it is lived, it is relational, it's interactional, and it needs what sociologists call societalization. In other words, it is taken for peace to become more than a noun, to become a verb, for this peace agreement to mean anything beyond diplomatic capitals or beyond the peace of men, because very often it is men who shout loudest and are politicians or have guns and are members of militaries and militias. For this peace to become enacted, it needs to be taken on board by individuals, by communities, by families. They need to give it a life of its own. They take on responsibility to make this peace into something. So they can take it in directions that the framers of the peace did not anticipate. They can consolidate that peace into everyday life so that it becomes a logic or a mode of thinking. And here I'm not talking about a peace of unicorns and rainbows. I'm talking very often about a grudging coexistence, about a peace that involves grief and loss, but an understanding that individuals and communities need to share territory with people they don't necessarily like. And very often, this peace is based on observed evidence. You can see that the other group are not in a stance of war at the minute, and therefore you take steps in reaction to that. So to make peace a verb, it's about internalizing and normalizing thought processes and ways of life. And for me, that relies on three interlocking concepts. The first is sociality, which is simply a recognition that we are all human. The second is reciprocity, which we all are aware of. It means holding a door open for someone in the expectation that they will hold the door open for you. And then finally, solidarity. And that's the most important, because that means standing with the other. It means more than something verbal. It means possibly symbolically protecting a minority or standing with them. Okay, so that's the first point, that peace is a verb. If it is to get beyond being a peace agreement, a noun, it needs to be a verb. The second point is to look at the domain in which peace is made and takes place. And clearly, peace and conflict take place at the local, the national, the international, and the transnational levels, and all levels in between. I'm particularly interested in this local level. And I've been somewhat frustrated at how both the policy and academic communities have used this word local in recent years as a catch-all, a bit like the other terms, sustainability, resilience, etc., that have been used of late. And on thinking about it, we actually all lead hyper-local lives. I mean, if you're in a city at the moment, let's just pick Rome or Florence, no one leads a Rome life. No one leads a life that is representative of the city. Instead, we have these micro-commuting routes, these routes built around school and leisure and retail and family. So we are incredibly localized. Home and the immediate surroundings of home are the really important domains. And of course, very often peace accords are made nationally for the whole nation. Well, that's fine, but no one lives a national life. Everyone lives a hyper-local life, and often that life is full of displacement and disruption in war-torn countries. So in a way, peace agreements often are made for territories that are imaginaries. And, you know, Libya and Afghanistan come particularly into mind when we think of countries that are, in a way, fictitious. They mean not a great deal to people on the ground, yet people on the ground live lives that are full of locality and kinship and networks, highly routinized lives. So I think when we talk about the local, we need to stretch ourselves and we need to move beyond what we use as a proxy for the local to try and access the hyperlocal. And what we've been using as a proxy for the local in peace building for the past 20 years has been civil society organizations. But civil society organizations aren't civil society. They are, in fact, the low-hanging fruit. They are easy actors, or relatively easy actors that we can deal with and call the local. But very often they're not local. They're based in the capital city, they speak English, they've got a 4x4, they speak the language of conflict resolution. So I think in a way, we've been, in a sense, making life easy for ourselves by thinking that civil society organizations are actually the local. I want to move towards a conclusion by saying that we tend to miss out the most important political unit that I think exists on the planet. And that's not the state, and it's not the political party. It is, in fact, the family. And if we think about our own upbringing and our own lives, very often our own socialization and politicization happened in the family. That's where you had the real conversations using the language that might not have been politically correct, that might not have been for public consumption. But that's where you learned your moral compass. That's where you learned what was politically acceptable and unacceptable. And I think one of the things that peace building needs to do is to recognize that family and kinship groups are actually often a natural political unit. But of course, it's really difficult to connect with that because the family is seen as being the private sphere and politics often is seen as the public sphere. I don't have an answer in terms of how to connect with the family in ways that aren't intrusive, but I think it's important. So let me finish with my last slide, and let me call them parting shots in a humorous way, or at least provocations. And they come from something called the Everyday Peace Indicators Project that I've been working on for about the last 8 or 9 years, in which we ask communities what peace means to them. So rather than us as outsiders telling people what peace is, we ask them, what does peace or security or insecurity mean to you? And very often, the answers are hyper-local. They're about peace in the immediate vicinity of the household. It's about being able to send your kids to the bus stop. It's about being able to walk somewhere at night. So on the basis of the Everyday Peace Indicators Project, let me make 3 concluding points. The first is that we need to think of peace in multi-scalar ways. So how do we connect the national with the local and the hyperlocal and recognize the transnational? That's very messy And it's very difficult to do. But I think the organogram of peace with straight lines is a fiction. And we need to take on board these multi-scalar realities. The second is that we need to think of time as plural. In a sense, we have, and I use we here to think of Western political domains. We think of time as linear and progressive. We think about it in standardized units in terms of clock time, in terms of there will be a 2-year implementation period for a particular provision in a peace accord. And of course, that's a very useful way to think of things, and deadlines are very useful for those who have to implement. But of course, not everyone has notions of time that are the same as us. For others, time is much longer, the longue durée. They're used to waiting in the long grass until those foreigners go away, and then they'll do what they want to do. They're used to thinking of time in relation to agriculture or festivals, not according to a log frame. And the final point that I would make is that for many people, peace accords, states, international organizations, the language that we use is often remote, inconsistent, and unreliable. They mean a lot to us, but to a lot of people on the planet in societies that are affected by conflict, we are quite irrelevant. So I think we need a bit of humility in a lot of our debates. So I'm going to finish with those provocations, and they're deliberately provocations because this is a round table and we're amongst friends. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. I think, as you told us at the beginning, the presentation was conceptual, but very much grounded into the reality of what's happening within society. So I have no doubt that now the following speakers, either Mariano Aguirre or Ambassador Kobia, will also find it quite easy to connect with some of the points that you've mentioned. I will give the floor immediately to Mariano Aguirre for his presentation of similarly around 15 minutes. Thank you, Mariano. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Virginie. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. My presentation deals with some aspects of the 2016 Colombian peace agreement's implementation, and with the hope that this experience would be, I would say, helpful for the future peace processes, hopefully in the Middle East. Among the series of complex and different issues related to the peace agreement in Colombia, I want to highlight particularly 3 issues. The first one is the resilience and resistance of the Colombian elite, or elites, I would say, to accept the agreement and the opportunities it presents for a democratic and social justice transformation of the country. The second point is that the limits of the agreement, I would like to stress the limits of the agreement regarding the complexity of the war economy in Colombia and the lack of willingness by the Colombian government and more in general the elites to deal with this issue. And third, and because of point 1 and point 2, there is a growing dangerous climate of selective violence and rearrangements, pacts and confrontations among the non-state armed organizations. So we could say that the war with Farc, the guerrilla movement Farc, is over, but different kind of violence are on the rise. As a brief summary for those not familiar with the Colombian context, I would say, or I would remember that the Havana Agreement, so called because it was negotiated in Cuba, involved one among the several armed organizations that operated and still operate in Colombia. The agreement did not have on board the ELN, the second major political non-state armed organization. But the agreement had a special relevance because the importance of Farc, the oldest and bigger non-state armed group. The 310 pages of the 2006 peace agreement includes a series of very important issues. Let me just brief include the modernization of the rural sector, which is a key issue given that most of the violent revolts since the 19th century in Colombia were due to the extreme unfair distribution and economic use of land. It includes security guarantees for the political participation of former Farc and civil society, and this in a country where activists, unions, journalists, academics, democratic politicians, former guerrillas, and minorities have suffered intense repression over decades. Also includes a transitional justice process based in three legs: the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is a special tribunal to judge crimes against humanity, a truth commission, and a unit for missing people, and also a comprehensive program for the substitution of illicit crops that includes the combat and prosecution of traffickers, corruption, and money laundering. The 2006 Colombian government Farc agreement was an opportunity to stop political and criminal violence and to initiate a peaceful modernization, or let's call it normalization, of the country without changing the economic and political paradigms. It means without changing the liberal economy and liberal democracy. It means both sides, the government, at that time the Santos government, and Farc, both sides agreed to negotiate the end of the war, and accepting violence should not be a tool for political purposes any longer. But for the leading promoters of the peace negotiation, the Havana Agreement was also the point of entry to political, economic, and social change of the country. They envisaged the chance to fill the gap between the urban, modern, and integrated in the global economy side of the country and excluded marginal and violent, mostly rural side of the country. This approach was shared and is still shared by millions of people in the country and by the international donor community. That change was supposed to happen after 60 years of different levels and intensity of war, or I would better say wars, between the state and political and criminal armed groups, left-wing groups among themselves, right-wing paramilitary groups and drug traffickers, militias against the leftist guerrillas, and everyone against civil society. The impact of this multidimensional violence was very dramatic in gross violations of human rights, massive as well as selective killings, and destruction of the social fabric in parallel with the development of a complex war economy. Violence also strengthened racism and inequality. Let me remind here that Farc accepted to negotiate the end of the war without preconditions regarding changing neither the economic nor the political system. And that meant a major advantage for the elites because the peace negotiations did not challenge their properties, their assets, and their privileges in a country profoundly affected by inequality and strong power structures. But the elites, the rural and most of the urban and industrial and the financial sector were very resilient, very reluctant to implement reforms, either about the use and tenure of land or the implementation of a fair tax system. As a matter of fact, Chapter 1 of the agreement deals with rural reform, with plans for modernization and social use of the land without affecting private property. But still, now, today, it is the less developed of all the issues negotiated in the agreement. Ivan Duque's right-wing Democratic Center, the party of current President Ivan Duque, campaigned against the peace agreement, particularly rejecting the transitional justice mechanisms, the inclusion of former Farc leaders in legal politics, the rural reform, and the gender component. And with this message, the Democratic Center of Ivan Duque got popular support in the referendum about the peace agreement in October 2016 and in the 2018 presidential elections. Further, Since assumed power in 2018, Duque's government strategy has been to abridge a sophisticated peace agreement that deals with the structural problems to just the demobilization and disarmament of Farc, and pushing, by the way, the international community to focus its aid and resources just on this topic. The government and its party have constantly raised political and economic obstacles to the transitional justice system, reducing the state contributions to their budgets. And although it's very interesting, thousands of militaries, business people, and former Farc leaders have testified before the special court, the special jurisdiction for peace. The government continues to criticize the juridical body, afraid that the possible complicities of some of their leaders, particularly former President Álvaro Uribe, with the paramilitaries in previous decades may come to light. Regarding the reincorporation of former Farc, the program has moved very slowly, generating frustration and incertitude. Let me address very briefly the issue of war economy. In Chapter 4, the peace agreement refers to the fight against organized crime, pointing to the complicities of the financial actors at the national and regional level and its international connections. Likewise, it points to the fight against corruption and money laundering, but avoids to explicitly deals with the reality of the Colombian war economy. Most of the modern irregular armed conflicts involve complex war economies, as in Colombia, where the licit and the illicit sectors are deeply connected and where part of the civil population is forcibly recruited to fight, subjected to sexual violence, obliged to cooperate and work with the armed groups. Just to give you a sense, a study by the National Association of Financial Institutions in Colombia stressed that the illicit economy amounted to the almost 40% of the GDP of the country and includes informal activities, labor, business and tax evasion avoidance, especially drug trafficking, illegal mining, and smuggling, among others. Colombia is one of a very complex cases of war economies in the world. It's integrated in regional and international circuits of drugs, gold and other minerals, timber, animal species, and human migrants. The peace agreement deals with this issue, but focusing just on drug trafficking without going beyond. And Duque's government did not address at all the war economy. Even the program of illicit crop substitution included in the peace agreement moved very slowly and in some regions has been stopped. The war economy is directly related to the critical and dramatic problem of the partial or complete lack of a state presence in around 40% of the Colombian territory. As a matter of fact, the second chapter of the agreement presents a series of economic, political development, and administrative measures called territorial approach, and if they were implemented, would represent a great advance in the expansion of the state and control of criminal organizations. But the Duque government has been very slow in starting the so-called stabilization plan for the so-called territories and to promote also a cadastre, something that doesn't exist at all in the country. In the meantime, the ELN, another very important or major group, various criminal organizations and Farc dissidences have occupied the geographical area that Farc controlled until 2016. There has been also an increase in insecurity in all the municipalities formerly controlled by Farc, with growing in the homicide rate. And the government in the meantime focuses its strategy in the so-called development programs with territorial approach, but isolating these areas from a comprehensive and necessary reform and not dealing with the warring economy or dealing just in a very vague terms and always from just a military perspective. The worst consequences of not expanding the state and not implementing the peace agreement has been the lack of protection for social leaders and for former combatants and their families and communities. Since November 2016, when the peace agreement was signed, until July 2020, 350 social leaders were assassinated in Colombia, and more than 230 former combatants has been killed as well. And it is important to stress that the targets are social leaders and former Farc implementing the agreement, committed to crop substitution or land reform. And although there are not massive killings in Colombia as decades ago, the rise of surgical assassinations are becoming a systematic form of political intimidation. Let me conclude saying that the peace agreement created the conditions for a peace-building process. As a matter of fact, it had a series of important impacts. The DDR of FARC combatants, a dramatic reduction in the level of violence in the first 2 years since the signing of it. Also, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Truth Commission, and the Unit for Missing People with many obstacles but are working. And in Congress, there is a renovation because there is a coalition of political parties and politicians following the implementation and trying to make the government accountable. And also many sectors of the civil society are very much mobilized. The civil society that we just heard in the first presentation, I would say both civil societies, and I fully agree about that there is a civil society which is much more international, global, and urban, and the other real civil society. And in this case, both are really mobilized. In the massive social demonstrations, for example, in late 2019 and early 2020, the peace agreement implementation was high in the streets and in the agenda. So I think that there are a series of question marks to make for Colombia and for other peace processes. Let me just highlight some of them. The first one is how to secure a peace agreement under what I would call the democratic paradox, that an elected government could decide to stop or block the implementation. A second is how to include the elites in the peace implementation when they feel, as in Colombia, secure enough to maintain their privileges and continue to live as the war is in another place and not at all affecting them, although we need to say they are living in kind of bubbles of security. And the third point is how to guarantee the security of the former combatants whom have delivered already their weapons, and the civil society leaders and communities that are practically implementing the agreement. And lastly, fourth, is how to introduce the issue of war economy in the peace agreements in order to both address potential violence and also the recovering of economic resources for the peace process. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mariano. I'm absolutely, very, very interested in many of the points that you mentioned also, because to some extent, I feel that they are also a kind of mirror to look at some of the issues that are also discussed and reflected upon in the case of Libya in this moment. Certainly not only, but looking at it from the perspective of what is currently being discussed for us in Libya, I think is very, very much useful to listen to you. I will certainly now give the floor to Ambassador Kobia so that he can also make his presentation for another 15 minutes before we can open the floor to a broader audience. Ambassador Kobia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Virginie. Do you hear me well? It's all fine? Good, excellent. Look, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the two presentations. So what I will try now is to give a humble perspective from the ground and share some thoughts, on personal experiences in the last 30 years in peace processes in various parts of Africa, of Asia, or the neighborhood. And I must say these experiences confirm a lot of what was said. So I also see Professor Narbonne. Luigi is a former EU colleague, so hello from this side. Look, to start with maybe, and to bridge academics and practice, I would say that we can see that both the doctrine and the operational peace building have been going through major paradigm shifts over the last years. When you look at peace processes and peace building, you see a fundamental change, and notably an increasing politicization of it. A peace process that you would see, for instance, like the one of Marty Ahtisaari leading in the early 90s in Namibia is a totally different world compared to today. So there's an increasing flavor or taste of politics, I would say even of partiality and self-interest of the nations in the international actions in peace processes. And there's also a widening tendency to favor stabilization over long-term peace building. So what we have seen is that the liberal school of peace building, as we have known it for the last decades, notably through the work of the United Nations, is waning. The center of gravity today of peace building is moving towards different paradigms that concentrate on stabilization, notably issues that are very important for the countries that are involved in the peace process, not the recipient of the peace process, but countries that are involved. And I notably think about counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, fighting irregular immigration, countering extreme violence, countering radical ideologies, etc. So the rationale is that security issues at large are prevailing over the traditional sort of peace trinity that you can see in many texts on peace, which is stability, security, and prosperity. So the reason is that third states mainly try to protect, as I said, their interests through the peace agreements abroad. So the focus is more and more on the external impact that the countries see rather than on the internal benefits. So I know it's a little bit of a depressing thing to say, but it is clearly something we see on the ground. Take the example of the UN missions. It started, in 96 on with the UN mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then you had also where that was followed in a way in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010 with the MONUSCO replacing the MONUC. And the MONUSCO has in its very change of the acronym, the fact that stabilization becomes important. And same thing from the MINUSMA, also having stabilization in its name. And then in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA. So all of these were called stabilization missions with several permanent members of the UN Security Council, notably the US and the UK, but also France, front-loading the stabilization aspect. So when I served in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the very early 2000s, the MINUSCO was indeed called the MONUC. And I think this change of term, so on the ground, a change of spirit that the acronym translated in operational terms. So when you look at the macro curve of peace processes, I think past experiences were mainly tainted with a Western color. I think we can all agree on that. With very clear shades of liberal structures exporting standards to situations that were unfortunately often too different to absorb them. And that was at all levels, from the UN to small NGOs involved in this area, to personalities dealing with peace processes and so forth. So peace processes were also, and I agree with Roger in that, but they were mainly linear and chronologically static with a firm and classic cycle and circle of conflict prevention, hard conflict, de-escalation, peacemaking, peace enforcement, peace building, etc. I mean, the traditional thing that we have all seen in the textbooks. So conflict was regarded as a life cycle with a start and an end. However, I think we need to ask ourselves, and this is, to me, still a big question mark when you look at history and the way, Homo sapiens has interacted with its own species. If peace is not just a period between two wars. When you look at Ethiopia today, after many years of stabilization, we can indeed wonder if conflicts do end, or if they latently remain in some shape or some form and come back after some time. So let me briefly look at two issues. The first one will be the challenges that we see in peace building, and the second one is what we can do. When it comes to the challenges of today's peace processes, I think the first challenge is really the state of the world. We live, I think, in a part of the Holocene that, you know, the Nobel Prize winner Paul Crutzen called the Anthropocene for other purposes, but I think it can be applied to peace processes. It does not make peace making and peace building any easier. I think there's more confrontation today than cooperation. The good old days of multilateralism, cooperation between nations, etc., with exceptions, of course, but has long gone by. And today's rapidly shifting alliances, changing policies have a perverse effect. And that is that the parties to a conflict think that they can win the war instead of negotiating peace. And this has a very strong impact, of course, on the implementation, which is the subject today, of the peace agreement. To give you an example, when I was ambassador in Myanmar, you could very much feel that the army believed that the negotiating with the ethnic armed groups was not entirely necessary because they thought they could overcome them militarily. Even if it was true, I would say, this would give a totally different dimension to the peace later on. Another challenge is realism. When you look at the way mediators and peace practitioners interact today, well, even traditional groups of like-minded countries have divergences, and highly respectful countries of human rights and democratic values very often inject very high doses of realpolitik and unprincipled pragmatism into their behavior. Even between allies, you see more tactic competition than strategic cooperation. So I think the interaction of internal and external factors of conflicts are mutually reinforcing and making peace building more difficult. Another challenge is the boom in interest in peace processes. From the mediation formally to the informal influence that leverages can have through the very often hidden and discreet work of partners. When there was, in the good old time, one personality like Annan or Atisari or an organization like Sant'Egidio, that was another world. Now you see clusters of countries that are very interested in peace processes, not only to bring peace, but also to bring their interests into the agenda. Another point is of this complex world is really the increasingly transactional world instead of being contractual. You know, short-term deals are very visible in international politics, notably these last 4 years, but we also see them in a smaller circle of peace processes. It takes place outside the classical institutional routes that lead to the peace, and it also leads to an abandonment, in a way, of the liberal values that have dominated the last decades. In a way, you have a paradox of atomization, where all actors, corporate, individuals, communities, clans, etc., are more empowered than ever. It's in a way the famous butterfly effect. And in a time of fast transitions and unexpected outcomes, you know, those who have Cartesian policy planning, or those who want to be planners in peace processes are actually going through very hard time, because you need to be much more reactive and much more short-term. Another challenge that I saw was that what happens before the peace agreement, so the negotiation, from conflict prevention to the conflict negotiation itself, matters and will qualify to a large extent the letter and spirit of the implementation phase of the peace agreement and its sustainability. You know, many countries have seen now peace processes as a foreign policy niche, and you wonder sometimes what matters more. Is it the process, to be at the table, to be part of it, or is it really the end state? And the mediators often do not measure having the nose on the steering wheel of negotiations, that what they do or what they say will have a very strong bearing on the parties and on the implementation of the agreement. Another challenge is the long-term versus short-term. I think the long-term peace building and nation building is sometimes overridden by a more narrow and short-term stabilization, as I already said. Clearly, both the short and long-term issues should be combined. It's not easy, but it's possible. And that is done in listening, not in talking. You remember what Horace Walpole said, you aren't learning much when your lips are moving. I think this is particularly powerful in peace processes. And my last point on this is that we are going from a burden sharing, which has been a very typical and classic, way of working of the international community, and a good one, I think, but we are transferring from burden sharing to burden transfer. The US, not to mention it, has had a structural tendency to decide alone and then bring other partners into a burden sharing exercise later on of the decisions that were taken alone. And I think in today's world, it doesn't work like this any longer, and there's a resistance of partners. So if you don't have an alignment of stars between policies and interests of the main parties, it is becoming very difficult. Now, 2 or 3 points on what needs to be done for sustainable peace building. Well, from personal experience, I would say one, ownership. If the parties do not want peace, well, you can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want, but you won't have a sustainable peace. If parties have been pushed into a peace instead of being convinced, the peace will not hold. And I can share one of my personal failures, because I think you learn more from failures than from successes. In the mid-2000s, I was sent by the EU to negotiate the ceasefire agreement between Khartoum and the Sudan Liberation Movement. That's a negotiation that took place in N'Djamena, Chad. And we were there, and it took us 1 full week to bring the parties to the negotiating table. Why? Because they didn't want to negotiate. So after a lot of work, after 1 week, they accepted to sit together and to negotiate a ceasefire. Obviously, they had no intention. It's only under pressure that after another week, they accepted to sign this ceasefire, and what happened was to be expected. As soon as we had left N'Djamena, the next day, the ceasefire was violated and broken. So that shows that ownership is key. Another thing we can do is, and I think Roger mentioned that also very clearly, there's no one-size-fits-all method. Every state, every situation, every process needs a different recipe. Of course, we can learn from other cases. We can build our knowledge and our wisdom, but we cannot transpose. So if you want to take a metaphor, it's a little bit like peace negotiators that travel to countries where they have to mediate or to work. Then they get into an international hotel where they have a continental breakfast, the same that they have everywhere in the world. And then in the evening, they look for a pizzeria in Khartoum or Bamako. Well, they do all that, and the same thing with peace. They transfer their continental breakfast into peace processes instead of trying to have and taste the local cuisine and using the local recipes. So if you try one-size-fits-all instead of a tailor-made approach, there's a lot of chances that you're heading into a failure. Another thing that I learned and we should do is try to optimize all the means that we have. That's a very classic thing to say and a very obvious one. But more and more what I saw is the need to have an interaction and an alignment between civilian and military. That was not classic. There was a silo between these two. And getting out of these siloed policies precisely to address all the former drivers of conflict and ensure they do not reappear is very important. The Rakhine conflict in Myanmar, in which I was deeply involved, shows the need to act early and to act holistically. And of course, we have not been very good in that, and the situation is what it is today. Another point is that in states with deep cleavages, let's not bring a centralized mechanism. These states do not want that. Just like weak states do not want, to have imposed solutions that are actually highlighting their weakness. So, for example, the EU has tried for long to make its development aid as the first donor in the world conditional upon a certain number of things, rule of law, democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. So there's an evolution there with a more assertive conditionality of many partners. And Afghanistan is a very good example of this, where we are trying to influence things in showing ex ante conditionalities instead of bringing them ex post when it is maybe too late. I'm getting to the end, and maybe one more point. The peace efforts also need inclusivity, and that was referred also. It needs to bring the widest constituencies. The stabilization does not achieve that, only peace building will. So all the non-state actors, the non-traditional actor, be there, frequentable or not, emerge as nodes of powers that can't be ignored. I think we translate that fact into the diffusion of power, as Nai said, or the fluidity of power, as Friedman said. So in Eastern DRC, for instance, in the Great Lakes conflict, you saw that the number of militias of all obediences or of no obedience at all constituted the necessary evil we needed to talk to. And if you exclude them, you're heading also to a conflict that might not survive. Because all these informal institutions often predate the conflict and survive it. So therefore, they are a tool to be considered for the effective capacity building. And this is based on the social rules that stem from networks and clans and militias on the ground. These informal institutions have always filled the gaps of weak states, and they should be recognized by capacity building as maybe an evil, but an unavoidable player. So if we consider peace agreement not as objectives in themselves, but as the start of a real phase of peace, this is where the highest attention should be given. I think politics are more interested, unfortunately, in the process leading to peace agreement than in its implementation. And if the subject of your seminar today is really the implementation of peace agreement, I think the responsibility for the peace implementation is unfortunately being given sometimes less attention than the peacemaking. And it is a pity, because we all know that it is in the implementation phase that peace is being made, much more than in the negotiation. So there's more ownership that is being given to the implementation phase than it is given in the negotiation. In the negotiation, countries, mediators want to have the ownership, and then they transfer the ownership to the parties in the implementation phase. But this is, of course, clearly too late. I will end in saying that maybe what we can learn from a number of peace processes recently is that short-term standardized methods, not locally owned scenarios, can only be analgesics that are going to be put temporarily on the conflict. The conflicts need long-term antibiotics that will rely mainly on local assets, on traditions, on customs, on culture. And peacemakers are supposed to provide these incentives that break the recurrent doom cycle of reigniting conflict instead of applying standardized methods. I will stop here because I know I've been out well beyond my 15 minutes, I think, and I apologize for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you actually provided a very good wrap up already, and also an introduction to the next phase of the discussion. I think maybe just responding to one of your latest points, the question would be, who is preparing the antibiotics? because I think based also on Mariano's presentation, and I remember previous conversations between us on the Colombian case and how much focus and much effort had been put on discussing and preparing the agreement, but then in terms of what would happen the day after, the actors and the parties were pretty much left to themselves. And I think this is certainly one thing that we observe in many of the processes that have taken place over the past at least decade. So how can this second part of the process, if we see peace building as a process in which the agreement is only, let's say, the beginning, I don't see that, because also of the kind of international atmosphere that you described, that there is much appetite for supporting such a long, difficult endeavor and process. So certainly here, there is a major obstacle, which is, even if we recognize the importance of the next steps, it's not very clear to see who are the actors that can get involved in supporting the following phases, and certainly leaving it to the parties doesn't seem to be the answer. And I think it maybe brings us back to the three presentations, and maybe this idea, who are the parties to any agreement? Of course, the three of you have insisted on the multi-layer dimension of conflict. To some extent, the multi-layer dimension of the agreements also, but it's not very clear how, what kind of processes or what kind of mechanisms and what kind of actors can contribute to link up the various layers and the various parties to the conflict. And the natural tendency has obviously been to focus on the elite level, the major players, either political or military, but then there seems to be a lack of instruments to bring in those other parties that would be the one involved in the everyday peace that Professor Mac Ginty was referring to. Again, I think there are many points in the three presentations that would require further discussion, but I don't want to take too much time. I would prefer to open the floor now for the discussion.